Well, here in studio, our next guest co-authored a report that ranks countries by gender gaps based on their resources and the opportunities among males and females. So here with the results of her study and just what it means for the global economy is Saadia Zahidi, Director of Women Leaders and Gender at the World Economic Forum. Thank you so much for coming in today. What has changed in the past year? We know economically the recession has really hurt so many people, but specifically with women, what has been the benefit? What has been the hurt?
Well, the first thing that we see is that the highest ranking country in the world, which is Iceland, has closed about 83% of its gender gap. The lowest ranking country, which is Yemen, has closed about 46% of its gender gap. What we found is over the last year, we've seen the greatest variation so far in terms of the changes in labor force participation rates of both women and men. But the data is really not out there yet. Next year, we're going to be able to say more about what was the real impact of the crisis.
We had heard from Catalyst and some other women's groups that perhaps the job cuts that we had seen since they were focused on traditionally male-dominated industries had actually bypassed women in some ways. So it'll be interesting to follow up on that. With Iceland in particular, they've now got a female prime minister in there. She was brought to sort of clean up things after the financial crisis. Right. Is there something to be said there in terms of how women are viewed post-crisis? Is there sort of a cleanup mentality in putting them more towards the front?
You know, there's a lot of data out there from behavioral economists who say that women have different risk-taking behavior than men do. So there is perhaps something to be said about in the post-crisis economy, should we ensure that women are there, not just to clean up, but to rebuild? There is quite a lot of data that's out there that says things like that. But I think what's really interesting is, crisis or no crisis, women will always make up one half of the human resources available to any economy. And any economy that's not educating them, making them healthy, and ensuring that they're efficiently integrated into the economy and then part of political decision-making is going to lose out in terms of competitiveness.
Why do the Nordic countries take such a leadership role here?
You know, we've got three layers of countries in the rankings. There's the bottom that simply haven't made the right investments in the very basics, the health and the education of women. There's the second layer, which are countries like Brazil or, let's say, the United Arab Emirates. They've made the investments in health and education, but then simply haven't got there yet in terms of entry-level participation of women. And so they're not reaping the returns of that investment. And then you've got the countries at the very top. So they've done everything right in terms of health, education, and entry-level participation, but then simply don't have enough women in terms of senior leadership in both business and politics. And that's where the differences come in. The Nordic countries have actually made it possible for women to combine both family and careers. They have the right policies in place, and other countries don't.
And yet, I mean, you look to the developed world and you would expect Europe to be at the forefront, but Italy really an outlier here, really one of the lowest positions. They even dropped this year 3 spots. Why?
Well, Italy has got the health, has got the education, and in terms of political empowerment, they're sort of somewhere around the world average, but in terms of economic participation. So you've got women who are as healthy and as educated, if not more, than men, but they're not being channeled into productive processes, and so it's a waste for that economy.
Is there anything here in terms of closing the pay gap between men and women, since we're seeing more participation now?
Sure. We've got 2 pieces of data on this in the index, and there's the hard data, which is looking at overall incomes of women versus that of men. And then we've got survey data. So it's the World Economic Forum conducts this massive survey of over 11,000 CEOs across the world and asks them for similar wage gap, for similar jobs, do women and men still have a wage gap? And we have never received a positive answer from any country in the world on that. So that gap remains wide and certainly is something to think about closing very rapidly.
Wow. Yeah, that's still troubling, even as in this country we see the White House be very vocal about creating this Commission on Women and Girls and saying we want to focus on this right now. But you're not seeing that pay gap close.
For the last 4 years, from what we can say, the gap hasn't necessarily been closed. There have been improvements in certain countries, and some countries have fallen behind. What we can say is, out of the 115 countries that have been covered for the last 4 years, 99 of them, that's over 86%, have actually made progress on closing gender gaps.
Good. All right. Well, thank you so much for bringing us this report today. It's an important one. It's Saadia Zahidi of the World Economic Forum.